When Madina invited me, I was quite struck by the title of this project, The Human Condition, and seeing that it is coming from the book of Hannah Arendt, and which recently I was revisiting, and I was thinking precisely about the decolonial in relation to her work. So what I will do is I will start by reading a couple of quotes from the prologue of the book, whose title is Gathering Us Here, because I think they are very illuminating to some of the topics we want to address, namely the relation of the human to the earth. So in the very first page of the book, this is how the book came out. In the very first page of the prologue that she wrote after the book was completed, the prologue is a very intense and puzzling text, so I recommend you to see it. The very first, I will read the first paragraph, and I will move from there. So Arendt says, in 1957, an earth-born object made by man was launched into the universe. Obviously, she's speaking of the 4th of October, when the Sputnik 1 was the first artificial satellite. And Arendt makes a big philosophical discussion about this. I will start again. In 1957, an earth-born object made by man was launched into the universe, where for some weeks it circled the earth according to the same laws of gravitation that swing and kept in motion the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars. To be sure, the man-made satellite was no moon or star, no heavenly body. Yet for a time it managed to stay in the skies. It dwelt and moved in the proximity of the heavenly bodies, as though it had been admitted tentatively to their sublime company. This is the first paragraph of the whole book. And then she goes on to say, the immediate reaction expressed on the spur of the moment was relief about the first step toward escape from man's imprisonment to the earth. This was a reaction in the media, and Arendt sees that it is philosophically very significant to say that it was the first step towards escape from man's imprisonment to the earth. For me, this is a very important observation because it explains and it shows the relation to the earth that has been in the making since the birth of modernity, to the point where we began thinking of our earth as a prison, as an object we should escape from, right? And this obviously is in a stark contrast with what we were hearing from Tony of indigenous philosophies or non-Western philosophies, where the earth is not a prison, but the earth is our habitat, is our mother, etc. So I'm using this moment that Arendt is highlighting to open the conversation about how the Western model of civilization has been one of separation from the earth. And this is, I think, appears very clear in these observations of Arendt. In page number 2, she says, now this is the last part I will read, nobody in the history of mankind has ever conceived of the earth as a prison for men's bodies or shown such eagerness to go literally from here to the moon. Should the emancipation and secularization of the modern age, which began with a turning away not necessarily from God, but from a God who was the Father of men in heaven, end with an even more fateful repudiation of an earth, who was the mother of all living creatures under the sky. The earth, Arendt says, is the very quintessence of the human condition, which is the title of our meeting. So with this, I will put this a little bit in suspense, and at some point I will go back to the image we have on our in the screen to speak about how the human has come to this relation to the earth. And so I will begin by speaking about anthropocentrism. I think we've heard the word already in this conversation. Anthropocentrism is how some of us are calling one of the characteristics of the modern colonial order. I will explain briefly what is a modern colonial order, because I'm aware that many people here are not aware with the vocabulary of decoloniality. But just to say that anthropocentrism is a way in which the Western civilization has developed its relation to the earth and to the human world as well, and to nature in general. So we are in a civilization that probably for the first time in history puts the human, the anthropos, as the center of reality. For many other philosophies, this is not the case. For many other philosophies, they cannot understand themselves as the center of the world, because they know their very life depends on the relationality with other dimensions of life. So, okay, I will go to the modern colonial just so that I can keep on speaking with this vocabulary. The modernity coloniality school that is coming up in Latin America in the last 25 years or so is a school that begins questioning modernity in a different way. So here you are aware with Hannah Arendt, of Walter Benjamin, Heidegger, Deleuze, Guattari, Foucault, all of the critical tradition, the Western European tradition. And this we call the internal critique of modernity. It is modernity being self-reflexive and making its own foundational critique, but it remains internal to modernity. So what the modernity coloniality school is bringing an external critique of modernity. How modernity is seen from outside the Western paradigm of knowledge, right? So, and that's why we write modernity/coloniality. Because we see that for us, modernity is not starting in the Industrial Revolution or in the Enlightenment. For us, and this is central thesis of the work of Enrique Dussel, modernity is starting in the colonial project, the Western colonial expansion, the conquest of Abya Yala, what the West will call America. And that is the moment of the start of modernity for us. And the reason is very simple. I mean, we saw in Tony's picture of the city made into squares. That precedes Descartes. This Cartesian square is there in the colonial power over life and of structuring life. So the argument is very simple. The moment the West becomes the West, the moment Europe understands itself as Europe, is the moment the colonial enterprise starts. Without the relation to the other, without the colonies in what the West will call the Americas, there is no self-understanding of Europe as Europe, and there is no self-understanding of Europe as the center of the world. So the image you may have of the world map in your imagination is a Western-centric image. It's a Euro-centered image of the world geography. And that image is impossible without the colonial enterprise. So the West acquires that position of center, of political, economic, but also epistemic center, symbolic center, the moment the colonial enterprise starts. So without the colonial, there is no Western-centered world, right? So for us, that is the start of modernity. The Western project of civilization starts at that very moment. At the moment it is oppressing the other, it is conquering the other. So the relation of conquest and the relation of exploitation, racialization, denigration of the other is essential for the constitution of the identity of the West. So we say there is no modernity without coloniality. Yeah? And when we write modernity, coloniality together, it doesn't mean that they are the same. Modernity expresses a particular movement and coloniality a different movement. I will go briefly into that so that we have some clarity about where we are talking from. Modernity is the control of the world, the control of presence. In the thinking of Heidegger, I think it's quite clear, it is a metaphysics of presence. It is the control of what I call two different levels, the control of the processes of appropriation, so the appropriation of land, the appropriation of minerals, the appropriation of animals, the appropriation of geographies, the appropriation of knowledges, and the appropriation of human life as well, right? So that is the control of modernity, how it begins appropriating the world around its center. And the other level of modernity, we have appropriation as a material moment of acquiring, of incorporating the world to its project. There is a parallel movement of representation. Modernity begins holding the right of representing the world. Yeah? So it begins saying, the world is what I say it is. How I represent the world. The big geographers of the Renaissance, the big Dutch geographers, for example, were claiming the right to represent the world as a truthful image of the world. Yeah? And that is the history of representation in which we are immersed, and is the history of the arts as well. Our arts are immersed in that dominant system of representation, which is, I think, one of the questions we need to address today. So appropriation and representation work together. You cannot appropriate the life of the other without a discourse, without a representation that will legitimize that appropriation. Yeah? So the emergence of racism and racial discourses comes together with enslavement. So you begin enslaving people, appropriating their lives, and at the same time you begin representing them as inferior. Yeah? So you see the work of appropriation, representation. You can only appropriate the earth as property with a discourse of the earth as an object. And we have the birth of the sciences dividing subject-object as a principle of knowledge in modernity. This subject-object division is anthropocentric. It's purely anthropocentric. So that's a movement of modernity, controlling the world and how the world is produced. The movement of coloniality is designating something totally different. It comes together, but it says something totally different. The movement of coloniality is about what is being, if we can say, on-world, what is being made invisible, what is made to cease to exist. So all the processes of genocidal processes, the process of destroying cultural artifacts, destroying religions, destroying languages, all these processes are about an erasure, are about subsuming the rest of the world and making it invisible and irrelevant for our conception of the world. Yeah? So we have that modernity to impose itself as the single reality of the world, and the Western project of civilization to impose itself as a single reality of the world requires the erasure of the other worlds, of the other options to be in the world, of the other ways of relating to the earth. So you have modernity, coloniality. You have a powerful movement of appropriation and representation coupled with a powerful movement of erasure, of the erasure of difference, of the erasure of otherness. So the decolonial option is a response to that understanding. If we understand the history of Western civilization, that is still the dominant project of civilization, as modernity coloniality, then our task is to decolonize. So there you have three moments that are not necessarily one after the other, but three moments. One is understanding the processes of power to produce a world, to appropriate a world, to represent a world. The other is understanding the power of erasure. And the third moment is to seek the decolonial option. What does it mean to decolonize? What decoloniality means? And we say it's an option because it is not a doctrine, it is not an ideology. We think it's an option among many other options. And this option is trying to reply to that structural violence I'm talking about. So when we talk of decolonial aesthesis that Madina, if my Russian doesn't fail me, spoke about when she presented me, decolonial aesthesis is about delinking from the modern colonial project of aesthetics. The modern project of aesthetics is the creation of a canon that will regulate sensing, sensibility, and the beautiful and the sublime, and that will also control it through its own institutions, what is art, what is not, the gallery, the biennial, the museum. So delinking from Western aesthetics means to open possibilities for other forms of sensing, other forms of embodying, of inhabiting the world that don't come from the modern colonial tradition. So a very simple example is in philosophy is to say not all philosophy comes from the Greco-Latin root or from the French-German debate, right? Is to say where there is languages, where there is people, there is other philosophies. Where there is people, there is other forms of aesthesis, of sensing and inhabiting and being in the world that are not recognized by the normative frameworks of aesthetics, of the arts. So that's why we say decolonial aesthesis and not decolonial aesthetics, because we are trying to find ways to open spaces, open cracks, as Catherine Walsh says, for these other sensibilities to come into the present and to be dignified and to be part of a more plural, wider present. So, so this is a little story in a very short introduction to what modernity coloniality is about and what decolonial aesthesis is about. We can discuss more in the questions and answers. Okay, I will go back to what I was saying of how the modern colonial order is anthropocentric. So this modern colonial order, the Western project of civilization, is built on the separation between the human and the earth, between the subject and the object. In the separation between the subject and the object, something very interesting happens, and is that not only the earth becomes an object, objectified, reified, and thus an object of measuring, an object of metaphysics, and hence always possibly a merchandise. It is the commodification of the world, the turning the world into merchandise, requires this step of turning everything into an object. And the subject in turn becomes an abstract subject. The subject becomes uprooted from the world. And the ideal of humanity turns more and more into a Eurocentric, patriarchal subject that relates to reality as to an object. And that becomes just a mind, an abstract mind. And this is a very clear denunciation of feminism, from Donna Haraway to obviously decolonial feminism, feminism of color, Chicana feminism, the struggle against that subjectivity that becomes the norm, that is masculine, and that has a position of abstraction in relation to the world. That subjectivity that is the norm, that we call the human, is not a very happy subjectivity, even though it's a dominant one, right? And that's something very important to see, because I think there is no winners in this model. And this subjectivity, Arendt has a nice quote actually where she says that it is the flight, the escape from the world and the escape from the self. She says the modern alienation goes in escape from the world and escape from the self. And this is the condition of this subjectivity. So if you become the norm, if you become the masculine, normative, rational subject, the price you pay is this alienation from the world and from the self. So I actually say, working more with indigenous philosophies, as Tony was inviting us, that if we see modernity from the perspective of indigenous philosophies, it is a very strange process. We don't see modernity as Foucault sees it, as a question of power, or as Deleuze sees it as a rhizomatic, radical immanence. We see modernity in a different light. We see modernity, or the Western project of civilization, as two things. One is as a project that is driving us towards death, because it builds its model of happiness, of development, in the consumption of life, the consumption of the life of the planet and the consumption of life of the others. Like what we were seeing in your video, how we consume the life of others and we never see them. And these are people in your own country, but just all our clothes, etc., we are consuming the life of others without the consciousness of it, right? So modernity, the Western project of modernity, the Western project of civilization, becomes very clear a project that is mounted on a path towards death, that is consuming life for progress, for development. And that's why they say that they are fighting for life. It's not that they are fighting for any ideology, they are fighting for a model of human society that will be based on the preservation of life and not on its consumption. That's one view. The other view that I get from listening to them is that the project of modernity is a project of separation. I think Tony was speaking of fragmenting. So it is this force of separation that enables systems of power to control reality, to control the real. And I say there is 3 levels of separation, specifically speaking of the human and the subject. There is a separation between the subject and the others, both its community and the others that are the extended community. So this subject, by being individualized, becomes separated from the sense of a community. The other, and this separation, there are many minute mechanisms that are doing that. One of the principal ones is the school. The modern education system is about separating the individual from the community. the indigenous people see it very clearly. Creating an individuality. And obviously, the model of humanity today is the global consumer. And this global consumer is made in the image of the corporation, right? He is all driven to consume for him or herself and to promote him or herself, to produce self-marketing as if it was a merchandise through social media, etc., etc. So you see this individual that is the standard of humanity today is an individual that is the economic subjectivity that Tillich was talking about, but is a subject that is made in the image of the corporation, and that is worshipping the self, right? We are in the times not of worshipping the earth or God, but the self, right? We are worshippers of the self. And hence all sorts of illnesses that we suffer in the consumer societies of depression, anxiety, consumption of pills, etc., etc., etc. These are illnesses of that self that is isolated. So there is this separation between the subject and his/her community, and there is the separation between the subject and the beyond the human. So as we were speaking of animality, all these topics are coming up, I think, as a challenge to that separation. So how our consumption of animals, our relation to the earth, and our relation to the cosmos has been separated. We don't understand ourselves anymore in relation to the beyond the human. And the third level of separation, so the separation from community, separation from the beyond the human, is the separation between the self and the inner life of the self, between the subject and his inner life. And an inner life that in many philosophies, apart from the consumer society, is plural, is communal, and is also connected to nature, to the cosmos. So this subject that is emptied is the condition of being functional in the consumer society. So I call this a subject that is trapped in the surface of representation. So all these theories like Baudrillard, like Bifo, speaking of semio-capitalism, of the control of the minds, and are precisely seeing that subject that is vacuated, that is emptied from an interiority, from a communal relation, and from a cosmological or natural relation. And this is, for me, the standard of humanity today. That's what we aspire that everybody in the planet becomes, a consumer, a global consumer. That's why we have projects of development to incorporate large parts of the population into global consumption, which is extremely worrying. I wanted to put this image of the separation to see how the Western project of civilization is paired with this logic of fragmentation and separation. And its systems of power only circulate through separation, through individualizing, through fragmenting, through categorizing both organisms and persons and mountains and territories, topologies, etc. This is a condition for the circulation of its power. And its power, the colonial feminists like Maria Lugones know it very well, circulates inside our bodies. A body that is racialized, a body that is put into a heteronormative framework, is a body that begins to be controlled from the inside by the structures of power. And the psyche of the consumer is, the desires are controlling. So we've seen a mutation of power from a power that was in early modernity, in a larger sense, let's say military or policing. It will become today a power of the control of desires of the people, of the consumer mainly. So we have on the one side of the planet the power of poverty, deprivation, exploitation, and on the other side we have the power over the desired structure of the people, right? So people are queuing for the latest phone in the millions to become special, right? You will be the same, you will do exactly the same as 10 million people that night in every part of the world to get the latest phone, and you are doing it to become special. That's the control of the desired structure of the people, right? So there are many ways to go here. I see I'm using a lot of time, but one of the important things about this is that one of the replies, if we listen to indigenous philosophies like Tony was inviting us to do, one of the replies to this model of the world that is leading us into a catastrophe, an ecological and human catastrophe, is the indigenous philosophies of relationality, of communality. For them, the resistance is not making a revolution with violence. The resistance is resisting fragmentation, resisting separation, reaffirming all these levels of relations that we cannot understand when we are individualized, we cannot see. So I think today, as Tony was saying, we have to learn from these other philosophies that don't come from the Western tradition of thought. And usually this is understood as romanticizing because it's a typical defense of modernity. Because modern thinkers, Western thinkers, refuse to accept that there is thinking that has a different genealogy, or what I call a different geogenealogy, that come from complete other traditions of thought. It doesn't mean they are not in contact with the Western tradition of thought, but it means they have other sources of meaning. And these sources that were denied and that were made ignorant by Western science, I think are today the sources that have answers to what we are facing. Because, as it was well said, and it's said by many people like Arturo Escobar and Boaventura de Sousa Santos, we will not find a solution to modern problems with modern tools. So we need to reach out in an intercultural dialogue to other ways of thinking, and we need to become humble. I think the humbling of modernity is an urgent task. Modernity has to cease to think that it is the whole reality of the world. And I know there is a lot of discussion about hybrid modernities and that modernity is very complex and multiple modernities. That's all right. But that doesn't mean that there is no one outside of modernity, speaking in terms of thinking, in terms of ways of relating to the planet, in terms of world making, of inhabiting the world. Now, because I don't want to leave you without speaking about this picture. This picture is I chose it in relation to Arendt text because it's a picture that is called Blue Marble. You have all seen it. And it's the first photograph of the Earth, taken by the Apollo 17 in December 7, 1972. And for me, it's an extremely important moment for thinking because it is the moment of what I will call the completion or the apex of the Western male gaze. This gaze that begins turning reality into an object reaches a completion at the moment of seeing the Earth as an object of representation. This is the moment that the Earth in its entirety becomes subject to the gaze that objectivizes the real. And for many, for decolonial thinking, we refuse this view. We refuse to accept the earth as an object of representation. Because the earth is not only a material entity, and the world is not only a material entity. For decolonial thought, for my own thinking, representation is part of the culture of the surface of anthropocentrism, of representing the world as surface, of living in a world of surface. And what this culture has, that is what Heidegger calls the metaphysics of presence, is that it is deprived of time. It is an image. We have become a civilization that is amnesic in a sense. Amnesic because it remains trapped in the surface of representation. So the fact that we have our phones, our pads, our screens here and there, for me, is not so much that the technology came and transformed our lives. For me, these are the technologies proper of our civilization, of our way of thinking, in which we reduce things to the surface of space, of the present. For indigenous traditions and for many other philosophies, you cannot reduce the earth to the surface of presence, because the earth has memories. So the memorial, the dimension of the memorial is a dimension also in Arendt, also in Benjamin, and many other thinkers, where the relation is possible. You cannot think of relationality, or of deep relationality, just in the surface of networks in the present. Relationality, when we are speaking of relationality, we are not speaking of networking, we are speaking of a deep relation, and it's a temporal relation. It's a relation in time, not in space. And we are now in the civilization that is bringing to its extreme the control of space and the subjection of our mentalities and sensibilities to the logic of space. What can be consumed, appropriated, represented. That's our reality. But everything that is relational requires time. So the relations that need to be recovered with the community, with the beyond the human, the earth, the cosmos, and with the self, are relations that extend themselves in time, that are impossible in the instant of the present. However, we are just trained to value objectification and the moment of the present. So that's why the understanding of time is essential for this moving away from the metaphysics of presence, from this moving away from a project of civilization that is driving us towards death. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. While defending these other genealogies of knowledge and ways of thinking, you use this term aesthesis in order to kind of redeem this idea of aesthetics, that kind of structured aesthesis, something like that. So I'm wondering why you still kind of retain to this term, which is also grounded in Western metaphysics, aesthesis itself. And if you, I'm sure you know the last book by Jacques Rancière, which is called also Aesthesis. And in this book, he never mentions any country except for America, some European country, Russia, and so on. So yeah, that's my question.
Yes, I mean, it's a very good question, and it's a common concern, right? Why we are still working inside the vocabularies of the West. And I think the task of some of us that are working in theory, in social theory and criticism, is to accompany the processes of struggle that are real and are there. But we are not at the center of the struggle of transforming the world. So for me, the movements, for example, in the whole of Latin America that are really changing the way they live, they are at the center of transformation. And I think the task of the intellectual as the center of the changing of the world or as a vanguard is gone. I think our task is one of translators. We need to listen to what's happening and speak it out, because there is a struggle that is not at the center, that is marginal, what is important, and it's the struggle, what we call the epistemic struggle. And that's what we are doing. If we have read people like Rancière or people like Derrida or Deleuze or Foucault, then it is us who need to confront that discourse with the tools we have, by listening to other traditions. It's not the task of the people in the struggle. So I think we are accompanying the struggle and being responsible to it. We are doing what we can from our positionality. We are not assuming a positionality that is not ours. And that's why we use, that's why we are somehow forced to use the concepts of modernity, because if I come and speak here of Amaitaiwasi or Sumakausai, Sumakamanya, Chachawarmi, we won't be able to go together in a thinking and a provocation. So I think we need to open up. So I think the task for us is that of the humbling of modernity. It's not that the West is all wrong, the West has many good things, but what is wrong is to assume itself as a total reality of the world. And many of the thinkers like Rancière assume that modernity is the totality of world historical reality, right? So even though they are criticizing modernity, they are reinforcing it by assuming it as a total reality of the world. Right? That is the problem of all of them, of the internal critique. It never escapes what I call the epistemic territory of modernity. And that becomes total and monocultural, even if internally it is diverse, right?
I want to support everything you've said, but I want to add something which goes back to the origin of Western thought and the relation between indigenous thought and Western thought. Because Western thought didn't come from nowhere. It came itself from appropriation. It came from another theft. Appropriation is just a nice way of talking about stealing. So this is a long and complex history, and I'm just going to take one example. The example comes from Wasat, the Temple of Wasat in southern Egypt, where the first Greek philosopher, Thales, studied. And acquired the kind of the knowledge that became the foundation of Greek thought. So where did that knowledge that Thales created come from? It came from Ethiopia. It came from pre-Pharaonic Egypt. So the history of Western thought partly belongs to Africa. But if you go to any library, and you take out a book on the history of Western thought, that's not where it starts. It starts with Greece. So that itself is an erasure. So the history of Western thought itself was built on erasure.
Yes, thank you very much. I think, well, the work of Enrique Dussel has been very productive in those terms. Like, for example, showing that the first registered of the word democracy was by Tutankhamun. And then he says, actually, democracy was first pronounced by a black man. So it's a term that has a different origin. But what is, I think, more important in terms of philosophical questions is that how the West invented its origin. And that's, if you open any book of any discipline, of standard disciplines of the university, it will all start in Greece and Rome. And there is an invention in the Renaissance of an intra-European exceptionalism that will erase all other sources. And this is very characteristic of how, which I think is even more important, how the West will relate to the past. Because it will colonize the past. And it will monumentalize the past. The West will produce a past that is fixed and monumental. When other philosophies speak of the past, it is never something fixed. The past is a radical diversity. It's a plurality that has the potentiality of transforming the present at every moment. And that's why the struggles for liberation, many of the struggles in Latin America, especially indigenous struggles, they say we have the past in front of us, because the past has the radical diversity necessary to transform the monocultural present that is oppressing us. So that is in stark contrast with the struggles of modernity for liberation that are always fighting for a utopia that is futuric, that is an imagination, and giving the back to a past that is fixed and death. So you see, it's a totally different conception of time, one that the West has colonized by saying past is fixed, the present is the only dimension of reality, and that's what our sciences and economy measure and interact with. And the future is where we go, and the future is an invention of our imagination, right? So, for instance, the Zapatistas, they will say, well, we don't have a future predetermined. We are just walking, but we know our past, and that gives us the strength to walk. And nobody can corrupt that past, because that past of suffering, colonization, etc., was lived. And it's there. And it's also informing them in different ways, like the notion of relationality, things like that. So the past becomes an open source of alternatives, instead of a fixed, dead notion that creates fundamentalisms, nationalisms, and monocultural understanding. So when we speak of the past, in the Western context, there is almost immediately a reaction that's conservative, that's romanticist, but they don't see that it's a completely different notion of the past that is radical, and that it has the capacity of transforming the present. And it has a very big claim on us, as Walter Benjamin will say, and it's an ethical claim, because the suffering of the past is real and is showing us what's happening today. Yeah. So just to go a bit deeper in what the critique of time is about.
Okay, any more questions?
Thank you. I also wanted to bring in the term romanticizing in relation to this question about the invention of origins. And I'm thinking about how the images that I showed by Kent Monkman, where he presents a revisioning of history, it's also a history that never happened, right? The paintings already are a certain romanticizing of events. And I'm wondering actually how you understand the term or the process of the movement of romanticizing, especially in the breakdown you gave us between, let me check my notes for a second. Yeah, the first move of appropriation and the second one of representation. Because I feel like romanticizing is something that achieves both. So I just kind of wondered how that term is working for you. Where do you place it within this larger problem?
Okay. Well, I use it here in a specific sense to deny that it was romanticizing, but we can also use it in a positive sense. Because I think sometimes I say when I'm told this is a romanticized position, I said, well, that's actually something to be proud of, because the Romantics were the first critics of modernity, reacting to the separation from nature and to the individualization of society, etc., etc. So there is a lot to rescue from there, and I think the critique of metaphysics, for example, of Heidegger is unthinkable without his reading of Romantic poets. So there is that trajectory that I think needs to be rescued in a Europe that will need to decolonize itself. So the rescuing of alternative thinkings of the West that didn't become hegemonic, right? But that's a work that needs to be done. It's already signaled by people like Santos. Something very particular about this and the Monkman work, I don't know, apart from what you showed here, but with the decolonial artists we work, in the summer school with Walter Mignolo, in the what we've written with Madina, things like that. That we've been working with groups also in Latin America. Unfortunately, I cannot mention everything now, but there is a notion for me that the colonial aesthesis separates itself from the idea of the contemporary, of contemporary art, precisely in its temporality. And so in a sense, in some conversations, I've been speaking about the end of the contemporary, not the post-contemporary, but the end of the contemporary. Because the contemporary, the tag contemporary, is completely subservient to the notion of time of modernity. It's the art that produces shock, that is radically innovative, that is praised as novelty, just like the commodity. And the colonial aesthesis is different, and what some of the decolonial artists are doing is clearly different, because they are not struggling for innovation, which is the task of whoever wants to make a career in the logic of chronology and contemporaneity and all of that. I think the struggle in my mind comes, what I say, under the sign of the return. So they are seeking to open spaces through their bodies and through their practices, performances or other type of media. They seek to open spaces for the silenced options, for the silenced histories. For instance, we have many Afropean colleagues that use their practice to bring about the memories of enslavement that produced the superiority of Europe as an art form. So they use the power of art to fracture the logic of presence and bring up voices that have been silenced for the last hundreds of years under the project of domination. So they are not seeking innovation. You can read their practice as innovative, but actually it comes under a whole different ethical project, and where they are allowing denied histories to speak through their practice. So for me, that sets them completely apart from contemporary art, because contemporary art is still under the doctrine of radical innovation. And decolonial art is not. Decolonial art, in my understanding, is coming under the sign of the return, a radical, critical return, a return that is not conservative, that is, on the contrary, is uprooting hegemony. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I just had a comment, and maybe you could even add your experience to it. So, I mean, you talked about a dialogue between modernity and alternative views of life. So, in my personal experience, like I come from India, and even our understanding of our traditional, ways of life are formed by modernity. So especially with the written, I wouldn't say all, but most of the discourse is formed by views which were, which were written in the, past couple of centuries. And it sort of goes into this loop, and it takes a lot of, I would say a lot of unraveling, a lot of reinterpreting, which makes it very difficult, because a lot of the understanding is oral. It's sort of, like part of the culture. So I don't know your experience dealing with such a situation. Any comments on that?
Yes, it's a very good comment, and it shows that it is not easy. Actually, the notion of tradition, just as the notion of postmodern, came together with the notion of modernity. Yeah, they are not prior or after, they are inventions of modernity. And and modernity came clearly with textuality. One of the big tools of discrimination of other knowledges was the superiority of textuality over orality. And thus the superiority of a linear chronology over the vernacular that had non-linear chronology, what I call a relational temporality. So this tension is there, and it needs to be encountered case by case. You need to be conscious that many of the things that reach us, of the alternative ways of thinking, reach us through modernity and are already in tension with it, or transformed by it, or erased by it. So I think this is one of the big challenges, and places like India and China and Japan are very lucky to still have their languages and some direct source of their tradition. In Latin America, we face almost complete epistemicide. It's archaeological sciences that are trying to find out what people thought when they were 500 years ago there, thinking and having very complex civilizations, poetry, sciences. It was all burned and it was genocidal. So it's a very big challenge.